continuing with our structure list, and again, now going over facial bones, just the bone. Then we'll go back and we'll actually fill in the little parts of each bone. That'll be a lot of fun. Okay, so our facial bones here, we talked about the mandible, the maxilla, talked about the palatine bone, that L-shaped bone. We actually we finished talking about the lacrimal bone, and that was the bone that is the lacrimal actually means tears. So if you think of basically where tears would go to the corner of your eyes, this bone would sit close to that area, and it has a little foramen or hole below it that actually allows tears to go down in the nasal passageways. Okay, so, and we also talked about zygomatic bones. So let's look at a couple of these again real quick, finish up this list, and we'll go in and fill in the details before we talk about sinuses in the fetal skull. So again, we are talking about the facial bones. So the maxillary bone, we have two of them. This big bone here makes up the majority of the facial bone. Talked about the mandible, which is down here, this other large jawbone area. Okay, then we even talked about the nasal bones being in the nose region. And finally, we were actually talking about the lacrimal bone, this bone right here in the corner of the eye socket. So let's look at it just a little bit closer. Let's see. Okay, so notice not the ethmoid behind it, but this little red area right here, and there's a little hole right down through here, but this is the lacrimal, that's the lacrimal bone right in the corner of one of the small bones. Of course, we have two of them because we have one on each eye socket area. So it's this little bitty bone that sits in there by itself. Okay, we had two zygomatic bones, the cheekbones. So, so you hear sometimes people say, oh, they have high cheekbones. So here's the zygomatic or the cheekbones. And we have the vomer and the inferior nasal conchae. Okay, so let's look at that. That's kind of, those are two really unusual bones. We actually see part of the vomer as the pointed area coming out through the nasal region, the bottom part, because it actually joins to something called a perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. It's actually a flat, narrow little bone, and let me get a good picture of it. Thought I had a much better picture of the vomer, but if you look at where my mouse is outlining here, this long, now not this down here, but this flat, kind of small, but it's long and skinny, sharp. This is there's a point right here that actually is coming out here in the nasal region, and this upper portion of it actually fits next to the ethmoid bone. So the vomer is a really oddly shaped little skinny bone. Now, this is a little section of the vomer where we can see it lies behind the palatine bones right here. So this is the back section, because the front section is actually protruding out through this area right here. So again, it's a bone basically in the nasal region, but we can see the back of it if you imagine that this is pointing out at you, kind of makes the front of the nose have a kind of a sharp appearance. So again, kind of points through this region right through here, and it's an unusual looking bone. Can't believe I don't have a better picture of it, but I will find one and I will show it to you later. Here's a sagittal section, so you can kind of see, here's the vomer right here, how it kind of runs through the nasal region, but then the back of it right through here, you could see if you looked up under between the pterygoid processes, which are the bat's feet from the sphenoid bone. So you can see it kind of fits up under here, but also look, you can see it looking into the nasal region right here.
Vomer.
Okay, notice these two areas here on either side in the nasal region called the inferior nasal concha, or conchae if we're talking about both of them. So
inferior nasal concha.
Okay, so they are actually individual bones. We literally have, on the ethmoid bone, we have a middle nasal concha and a superior nasal concha, which we'll talk about later. But for right now, we're actually talking about bones. So let's look at it from a slightly different perspective. So inferior nasal concha here, we see it, the blue areas here on either side, and they're actually on the inside of the maxillary bones. So let's look at that from a model. Okay, looking at this picture, of course, the big bone here with the teeth coming off is the maxilla. We still see the back of the palate, the bone that's an L-shaped bone, the palatine bone. We see a bone at the corner of the eye socket, that small lacrimal bone. Lacrimal means tear. But what we're actually looking at here, I'm going to outline it, is this bone that, looking through the nose this direction, this bone right here is that inferior nasal concha. Or if we were talking about both of them, we'd say inferior nasal conchae, and we'd add an E on to the end of that term. So now these are the list of the actual bones that we've been going over. So first thing, you should definitely make sure that you can, pick out any of these bones, no matter what picture you're looking at, because don't get fixated on a specific picture, but say, what is always around the frontal bone? Where's the frontal bone always going to be? What's going to be in the forehead? What's always going to be attached to the frontal bone? Well, behind it are the parietal bones, and the ethmoid is going to actually make some connections with it, and it's going to make up part of the orbital of the eye. So when you start learning these, learn what's around these. And that goes for all of them. Okay, now that we've gone through the bones, let's look and see what are parts of these bones. Sometimes I'll have something listed. It may be part of more than one bone, but I will only list it once. Okay, the glabella is definitely this area that is affiliated with the frontal bone. We can see that it's kind of this indentation here between the two margins that's over the orbital of the eye. Okay, the next area, the supra, means above orbital. Foramen, the hole above the orbital of the eye. Sometimes the supraorbital foramen is incomplete. It doesn't totally close up, or it forms more of a notch than a hole. Therefore, we would call it supraorbital notch. So just know supraorbital foramen or supraorbital notch are the same thing. The supraorbital notch, the bone doesn't completely form a hole, but instead forms a notch. Either one can be there. Next is the parietal bone, and all we have near the parietal bone are the sutures, or areas where bones come together. And when we have the sagittal suture and a coronal suture, which come next to the parietal bone and join it to other places. So let's look at that. Here we see the sagittal suture that connects one parietal bone to another. Notice it makes like a sagittal line across the top of the skull. Here we see the coronal suture, which attaches the parietal bone to the frontal bone. And corona means crown, so if you imagine, that's kind of where a crown could fit, going across the head like a Miss America crown. Okay, notice we have temporal bone here, and several things under the temporal bone. But notice one thing that we have something that says squamous region, tympanic region, mastoid region. Now these regions kind of divide the temporal bones up into into several major parts, but what we're really interested is what is in the region. So I probably will not ask you the region, but we still want to divide this up because there's so many parts to it. So notice we have squamous region, tympanic region, mastoid region, and petrous region. So what do we mean by the regions? And then we will see what's in each region. Okay, notice from this external lateral view that I've got this suture line here called a squamous suture. And squamous means flat, and this portion right through here, if we rubbed your hands on it, it would be very smooth and flat. So this is the squamous region, or part of the temporal bone. Now, if I go down to this area right through here, this is where the mastoid process is. So this is the mastoid region. And then right around the ear canal region is the acoustic region. And then we look at the next part. Okay, here's that mastoid area. But if I look at this area right through here, okay, it's called the petrous region. And this is one side of it. The other side of it looks like this. It's actually right through here. And it's kind of a mountain. So petra means rock. So if you think this rocky area, or this rocky mountain, so to speak, would be right through here. Okay, now that would be the smooth portion from the inside, the squamous region, and that would be the petrous portion, the rocky, because again, two-dimensionally it's hard to tell, but that's a little hump or lump, and it's got these holes in it we're going to talk about. So looking at this individual temporal bone. Again, notice the flat area here is the squamous region. Notice that the external acoustic canal is actually in the tympanic region. Notice that's that whole area, and that acoustic and tympanic really go together. When we talk about the ear, we'll be using those terms, but that's basically your ear canal right through here, and it's in this region, the tympanic region. Your eardrum is actually called the tympanic membrane, so that's where that term comes from. Okay, then we've got this big hard place behind your ear called the mastoid process. It's in the mastoid region. And then we've actually got, again, if we turn this over, we get this, here's our mountain we talked about right through here. And of course, that's our brain is sitting over top of this, and the nerves from your ear are coming out and going to your brain through that hole right there. So this mountain is the petrous region, and petra means rock. Okay. So the flat region had a suture that connected it to the parietal bones called the squamous suture. The tympanic region has that external auditory meatus, in other words, the ear canal. The petrous region was the thick mountainous region. The mastoid region contained the mastoid process and contains these other things. So let's look at the mastoid region for a second, because it contains not only the mastoid process, but a sharp pointed area called a styloid process and a depression where the mandible fits in. So I got this hard area behind my ear. You can feel it if you tap on that hard bone behind your ear. I've got this sharp thing right here. That's a styloid process. Process is a projection off of a major portion of a bone. So here's a mastoid process. You can literally feel it by tapping behind your ear. This styloid process, a connective area, and then I've got this little depression right here near the styloid process, a depression right here, and the same depression right there, and that is the mandibular fossa, meaning the mandible fits in here to articulate with the rest of the skull. So it's called the condyloid process of the mandible. Fits in this little depressive area so our mandible can fit with the rest of our skull. Even though I've covered a few of these foramen or meatus, I'm going to save the rest of these and do all the foramen at the same time. I think you'll get more out of it if I do it that way. But notice all of these canals or foramen, these holes in bones, are in the petrous region, that mountainous looking region. Okay, so let's move to the occipital bone. Let's look at the lambdoid suture, the foramen magnum. We'll go ahead and mention that one, it's so big. Occipital condyles and external occipital crest and protuberance. Okay, again, here's our occipital bone. You can see this big hole here, again, where your brain and your spinal cord meet, called the foramen magnum, the large hole. Okay, extending from that to kind of a little bump you can probably feel in the back of your head. This is the external occipital protuberance, and this area leading to it is the occipital crest. Then we actually have some rounded areas where the skull actually articulates or fits on top of the C1 vertebrae. These rounded areas here next to the foramen magnum are occipital condyles. Let's look at a different perspective on them. Again, we actually see the foramen magnum, we see the crest, we see the protuberance here, but this kind of rounded area right here, that literally is what sits on the C1 vertebrae, is the occipital condyle. A condyle is a rounded area where two bones articulate. So where the occipital bone articulates with our vertebrae is right in those little areas. Here's basically the same view, but maybe you can see it a little bit easier. That rounded area right through there, and that rounded area right through there, occipital condyles.